Good morning, team. I think we're live. Yes, we are. Awesome. It's Monday here, but I know some of you will still be in the throes of the weekend. How is everything going? Have you had a good weekend? I have had one of those really blissful weekends where when I think about it, I still smile. and I did quite a lot of adventuring with my ponies this weekend in hand. And that was really cool. Yesterday morning, I got up early and we live on the edge of a big inlet or a big estuary that leads out to the ocean. And it's a packed mud flat. So at low tide, obviously when the tide goes out, you can ride on it or you can work on it. And I hadn't taken Nadia down there yet. And I thought, I think we'll go for a bit of a wander down there. So that's what we did. It's always really interesting because it's quite squelchy underfoot. Like it's not like sand at the beach. It's more like it has quite a lot more give and it tends to hold quite a lot more water. So the consistency of it or the feeling of it underfoot can be a little odd for them at first. And you have to go down quite this quite steep bank to get onto it. So I'm always interested to see how they're going to handle themselves. She was totally nonplussed about it. Really cool, really happy to be with me, which was the biggest excitement, I think. It's always really gratifying when they stay with you and everything's calm and relaxed because it's kind of like a big amphitheater. So according to natural instinct, it would be a really unusual place for them to hang out because there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong and they're really exposed. So it's always a really good testing place to see how things are going. So, yeah, it was just really lovely and we had a lovely morning. Good morning. Hi, Belinda. It will be Sunday in Texas, I believe. Yes, and Sunday for you too, Kelly. Thank you. Yeah, it was such a lovely day. It was nice to kick off like that and to get a chance to actually do that because with two little children, many of you out there will empathise with how difficult it can be to actually arrange your day so that you can get out of bed and get going early. And that's only been something that's really been able to happen over the last little while. So when the opportunity arises, it's like I have roller skates on and I'm kind of like racing for the hills. Bev, hi. Yes, Sunday in Sweden too. Awesome. You can definitely catch this later. It will be recorded and left on Confident Rider, and I'll put it on YouTube as well. So today is a continuation of Friday's discussion on anxiety. And on Friday, we really got into how you can, the importance of understanding the subtle messages of anxiety and its relationship to fear before it becomes a full-blown event. The metaphor or the analogy that I used was one of a car. If we're driving our car and a warning light comes on the dashboard, many times, if you're not mechanical or not inclined to investigate these sort of things further, you can ignore that signal. You can ignore that light, especially if it disappears and then comes back sporadically. But the longer you ignore it, obviously, the more potential there is for something to go wrong in a lot bigger way. And the reason that I think this is a really good parallel to draw is that if you are ignoring the subtle messages behind anxiety, the subtle messages behind fear, you remove yourself from the ability to action a solution early on in the piece where it hasn't gained so much momentum that it feels like this big force that you need to overcome. When we are desensitized to those messages, or we really haven't been taught how to recognize them and then further on from that, how to process them, anxiety can become a huge experience. It can become an event. And when we go to that place where we are experiencing anxiety on an ongoing basis in relation to our riding and otherwise, because quite often what happens when we are in the midst of experiencing anxiety in our horse riding, often we experience in our life the same kinds of variables of emotion and vice versa. So the danger is that we start to identify with anxiety as an intrinsic part of us. We start to remove ourselves from the observation of anxiety as an experience, as an emotional experience, and we use it as further evidence to solidify the perception that we are starting to formulate of ourselves, of us as an anxious person, us as an anxious rider, us as an anxious horse person. The danger of this fusion is we shut down our capacity to action a solution. We shut down our ability to say, okay, I'm recognizing what is happening to me as a behavior. Is there validity to what it is that I'm experiencing, in that what is it that I need to recognize or take from this experience of anxiety and use to action a solution? And instead we look at it and we go, oh, here it comes again, and we start to run. We run from fear and we run from anxiety, and it's like we're constantly waiting for them to creep up on us. When we become addicted to the feeling of anxiety, that is what it feels like. You no longer trust your ability to feel relaxed. You no longer trust your ability to feel calm. And in those moments when you actually are in a situation or are in a mood state where things feel like they're going well, you get that little bip that comes up in your mind that says, oh, wait, it's going to come. When's it going to come? When's anxiety going to come? When's fear going to rise up? Because that's something I'm familiar with, and I'm not trusting of the fact that I could feel any different from that. Something really important to consider is that particular situation, because we do become addicted to the emotional frameworks that we operate from, for better or for worse, on a regular basis. And that emotional addiction is biochemically motivated as well. Every emotional pattern that we create, or every emotional state that we experience, has its own biochemical blueprint. And after a while, you become addicted to the experience of that. Your cells literally become used to the experience of that chemical mood state. And so in the recognition of that, you can understand how it becomes very easy to perpetuate feelings from the past and start to introduce them into your future just because you're used to feeling that way. What we need to do is get into a situation first of recognition, or first of mindfulness, when we're actually in those patterns, when we're in the midst of an anxiety pattern that isn't serving us, to understand what it is we need to do strategically in order to move forward, and then to be able to dedicate ourselves to a series of ongoing decisions that come off the back of that strategy to practice a different way of being. Is it easy? Not necessarily. It's not necessarily hard either, but it is an ongoing decision, an ongoing choice to actually choose to create a different feeling, and to sometimes, and we're going to get into this shortly, to recognize that actually the experience of anxiety is necessary in order for you to create a different pathway in your mind. The experience of anxiety is necessary in order for you to be able to see a situation which creates anxiety within you, and to be able to take through to a different solution. That's very much to do with anxiety that comes as a result of an emotional trigger or an emotional memory. One of the key examples of that is in the case of injury, where you have an experience which has created emotional or physical harm. So it's had a lot of charge emotionally and neurologically, and your mind stores that information as something that needs to be watched out for in the future. So you can bypass the actual thought process of anxiety and go straight to the response if those emotional memories or triggers are there. Good evening, Noreen. Nice to see you. Yay, we've got lots of people from the other side of the world here today. That's so cool. So let me know whether you are in the midst of a challenge that is, related to anxiety, how that comes about, because I can help you nut out which of the two pathways we're going to discuss now applies to you. And there can be a mix of both, but we're going to get into that shortly, because I think it will make more sense once we've actually talked about the different ways that it rises up. The main thing to recognize is that in any situation, we are taking a whole host of information from our environment. And for the most part, that comes via our sensory systems. So your unconscious mind is gathering information all the time based on what it is that you're seeing, what it is that you're hearing, how it is that you're feeling, and of course, smell, taste, and touch to lesser extents when we talk about our writing. Now that information gets sent to a part of your brain called the thalamus. And I think of the thalamus as like a road traffic conductor. So it like takes the information and it kind of directs it to the different parts of the brain that it needs to be paid attention to. And in the case of anxiety, there are two main pathways that we refer to. I've broken them down to a thought and a feeling pathway. And the thought pathway is controlled by your cortex, and the feeling pathway is controlled by your amygdala. In any case, the experience of anxiety, that physical experience of anxiety, is activated by the amygdala. But the two different ways that it can arise are either via this thought pathway or via this feeling pathway. Now, these two pathways are what I've extensively researched and put together a course for in Calm, in Joyride. So if you're interested in really diving into this and getting into the solutions, that's absolutely available and there for you. So the cortex is responsible for making meaning. That is what allows us to decide what a particular event or a particular situation means for us. It controls our perception. Perception is really huge when it comes to anxiety, because we know that some of the physical experiences that arise off the back of the anxiety response, such as increased heart rate, that feeling of being flushed, maybe a slight clammy or sweaty feeling, all of those feelings that we would typically associate with anxious or fear states are also the same for excitement. So that physical response can be you being in the midst of an anxious experience or a fearful experience, but it can also mean you're in the midst of a joyful or an excited experience. And the only differential between those two experiences is context, is perception. And this is where our cortex is, the key driver, and where attaching meaning to an experience becomes really important, because meaning comes off the back of you deciding what something means for you. That in turn is influenced by your beliefs. So if you are operating from an empowering belief set, the meaning that you attach to something may create an empowering context for you, which means even if the situation is not ideal, you're able to take something from it which essentially doesn't cause you to feel deflated or demoralized. It allows you to move forward in a productive way. The other side of that, if you're moving from a negative belief or a limiting belief system, you can do the absolute opposite. So the same situation you attach a completely set of different meanings to, you create a different perception for, and the amount of effort or the energy that you invest in that moving forward will be totally different because you have seen that event happening from a different way. So this is where the cortex comes in. It's perception, it's meaning, it's a meaning-making machine. It's also responsible for us deciding or anticipating what certain events we're experiencing in the present might mean for us in the future. It's a really valuable part of our brain, obviously. And what it does, if you can think of it this way, I basically think of us taking in a whole lot of different information, and then we shoot out 3 or 4 different possibilities, different imagined possibilities into the future, where we anticipate what might occur. Now, in the situation of a healthy functioning anxiety system, and there is a healthy functioning anxiety system where our senses are sharpened, our intuition is really intact, and our focus is really on point, we can make a decision in that moment about what something means, choose the best course of action to move forward, and then move out of that thought process into an actioned thought process. So we take an emotional message, we translate it into logical thought. So that's really the height of your emotional intelligence. And then we use our physical intelligence to actually translate that into action. When we are stuck in a poorly functioning anxiety situation, we take the same information, we project a number of imagined scenarios into the future. But in this situation, they tend to be negatively geared. They tend to focus on what we don't want to happen, what we're afraid of happening, or the worst case scenario. So in the case of an event you have coming up with your horse, for instance, you might see your horse misbehaving. You might see you embarrassing yourself in front of other people. You might see everything going wrong. And that freezes you in time, because basically you create if you've associated that event or leapt into that event with enough detail, you basically give your unconscious mind enough information to clock that as real, and you experience the anxiety response off the back of that, even though you are far removed physically from the actual event that's going to cause you concern or is causing you concern. This is where we get into a chronic experience of anxiety by actually imagining the worst case scenario, doing that with enough vividness. Is that a word? We're going to use it as a word. Doing that with enough clarity to actually feed your unconscious mind with all the information it needs to feel that that event is happening right now. And we're constantly engaging that anxiety response. When we constantly engage that anxiety response, we become addicted to the feeling of anxiety because that becomes our normal. Neurons that fire together wire together. So we create these thought clusters or these thought networks that become very easy for us to default back to. When we do that, we are in the midst of a low grade, but sometimes high grade anxiety response that starts to fuse with our identity. And this is where we get into these cycles of identifying with ourselves as anxious riders, identifying as anxious horse people, and getting to situations where we're talking ourselves out of scenarios that we're actually very competent for or competent enough for, where we are experiencing disempowering feelings or fear-based states with our horses even before anything has gone wrong, and finding ourselves in setups where we are actually potentially filled with dread. And I use that word purposely because I know these are situations that arise all the time, filled with dread about what is going to happen, even though we have all of the skills that we need and for all intents and purposes our horse is fine. So you can see how really understanding where your thoughts are going and how to utilize them in the best way possible, how to direct your focus, how to manage your self-talk, and how to actually manage yourself physically so you're taking those emotional pathways and translating them in ways that are really useful to you. How these are skills that need to be developed. We need to step in and recognize when this emotional addiction is occurring, when we're actually getting to a stage where we have fused ourselves with the behavior of anxiety and the experience of anxiety and taken it on board as just an intrinsic part of us. So these are all parts or components that we need to take care of. Rumination, self-doubt, worry, these are all side effects of an anxiety cycle, of a thought-based anxiety cycle that isn't serving us. And as a consequence, we need to initiate thought-based solutions. We need to understand where our mind is going and when our thoughts go astray that lead us to the experience of anxiety, and start to interrupt the pattern at that point and give ourselves the ability to take things in a different direction. It's not necessarily easy at the beginning, but it gets easier over time because these are practiced skills. The feeling of anxiety is a behavior. We need to first be able to understand the message behind it. So are you safe primarily? Is there something that you need to pay attention to? Do you need to get help in this particular context that you're facing? And when you do that, you're able to create a strategy off the back of that. So that's understanding and taking what you need to from the message. And then further on from that, understanding how you may have got into a practiced response of anxiety. How it is that you are contributing to anxiety when it's no longer valid, when you're actually creating an atmosphere of anxiety just because it's become something that you're used to feeling, and because you've strengthened the pathways enough that you're constantly in a defensive mode, where you're constantly looking out for things to be concerned about, where you're worrying and ruminating and stewing over things in your mind to the point where it feels like you're stuck on a thought loop, like a broken record. So that's the cortex-based response. That's the anxiety response that comes off the back of that thought-based pathway. The other pathway is one that is activated by the amygdala straight away. So we have these 3 points where all of the information gets sent to the thalamus. When it doesn't recognize something that it feels needs to activate our survival mechanism straight away, it sends that information to the cortex, and that's where we have a chance to really have a think about things and what they mean to us. In situations, however, where there is an emotional trigger or an emotional memory, it can shoot the information straight to the amygdala, And this is where we have experiences where there feels like there's absolutely no thought behind the anxiety response, where there is no logical reason for it, where it just doesn't seem to make sense. Many times the phrase that will rise up when we are in the midst of that is, I just don't know why I feel this way, or this is so frustrating because I know that my horse can do this, I can do this, and yet I still feel really afraid. I still feel really anxious. It just doesn't make sense. Anxiety doesn't have to make sense in this instance. It doesn't have to have a logical basis. It doesn't have to have a thought process behind it, because all that has happened is you have had a situation in the past which unconsciously you have registered as some kind of threat. It can be an emotional threat, it can be a physical threat, and it doesn't even have to be something where you've actually experienced harm. Then, for example, you can be in a situation where you actually have experienced a physical injury, and there seems to be some kind of logical understanding of why you might feel that way, even though it doesn't seem valid anymore. For instance, in situations where people have had one-off events come around, I call that rusher attacking, where you're like, it was out of the blue, there was nothing anyone could have done. I know it wasn't my horse's fault. I know it wasn't my fault. It was just one of those things. I know the chances of it happening again is so minimal, and yet I continue to hold on to this feeling. I continue to feel in this situation completely just out of my league and afraid, even though rationally I know there's no basis for that. What happens is unconsciously we're always scanning our environment for indications or clues that we can hold on to provide us with shortcuts in the future. It's just like when we're children and we learn that something is hot. You don't touch the fire. There are certain indicators which unconsciously we recognize, which teach us we don't want to put our hand there because we're going to get burnt. It stops us from having to go through the same long-winded processes of experiencing harm, understanding what that harm means, just so that we're not repeating those same situations again. Now, we're doing this all the time. Essentially, we're anchoring ourselves to different experiences in the environment to ensure that we don't go through the process of experiencing that again unnecessarily. The flaw, I guess, in this mechanism, if you want to call it that, is that it can hold on to things which don't necessarily prevent us actually, or what's the right way of saying it? Your unconscious mind can anchor things or connect you to things within your environment that actually are superfluous. It likes smells. It could be the smell of something which was present when you were in that accident state, and just that smell can take you back to that place, will activate that feeling of anxiety. So when you have an accident or when you go through some kind of emotional trauma or anything which your mind deems as potential harm, it takes or grabs onto different things in your environment which it can connect to that feeling, so that when you are in the situation in the future where those common elements arise, you go straight to that survival mechanism. You go straight to that feeling of anxiety, because in your mind, or according to your mind, it has your highest best interest at heart, and it's basically just wanting to tell you that you need to get out of there. In the case of our writing, when we've anchored ourselves to situations which actually are not valid to our survival and safety, this becomes a really frustrating part of our unconscious process, and something that we need to actually create a strategy around moving forward through. Because firstly, you need to realize that your mind is never trying to work against you. That survival mechanism that can sometimes be really frustrating and unnecessary is never something we want to get rid of. It's our ability to override conscious thought and go straight to a feeling state, go straight to a response, that is one of our most finely tuned survival mechanisms. It's like if you're in the way of a moving car or a child is in the way, it's you grabbing the child and throwing them out of the way, out of harm's way, before you've even thought about it. That is the power of that mechanism, to override all other functions in your brain and go straight to that response state. Now, the feeling pathway, this is what I'm referring to. I'm referring to those experiences where you are in a situation and all of a sudden you feel anxiety. It can be really overwhelming, or it can be just that underlying feeling of anxiety, dependent on how that emotional response has been anchored in you and how it occurred. So the severity is a strong word, but the strength of that emotional feeling at the time that it arose. The understanding then is the thought-based pathway is a very different experience of anxiety to the feeling-based I'm tripping over my words, feeling-based pathway. In thought-based anxiety, we have a thought process that contributes to the feeling of anxiety arising. In the feeling-based pathway, we go straight to the feeling. It doesn't feel logical. It doesn't have to be logical. It doesn't necessarily make sense. And it can be flying in the face of everything else that you know. So you can see, based on how these two different pathways arise, the solutions for both are really different. We need to get you into a situation, if you're in that feeling-based anxiety, where you can retrain the feeling, where you put yourself in the path of the anxiety, allow the feelings to come up, because it's actually a really necessary part of the process, unfortunately, in retraining your mind to associate a new set of meanings and a new set of experiences and anchors to that same trigger or stimulus. So we need to do that in a really conscious way. We need to make sure that we've got to the place where you are upskilled, where you do have tools, where you feel that experience of anxiety come on, you're able to lessen it and get your mind back to a place where you're able to actually initiate a different way of going forward, a different way of actually dealing with and contributing to and working through that anxiety. The thought-based pathway and the feeling-based pathway, they can intertwine. One of the common questions I get is, well, I have kind of both of those, and that makes sense. If you think about it, once you have experienced some kind of trauma, you're in a situation where you notice that feeling pathway is being activated. So you're in that anxiety response, even though there is no conscious thought attached to it. It makes sense then that you would start to be concerned about that happening again. You start to worry, you start to doubt yourself, you start to be really down on yourself. And so you have these two pathways that are being activated because they're feeding into each other. What's really important then is that we deal with both. You understand how to actually manage your thoughts and send them in a direction that's helpful, how that's a really practiced process that you need to make conscious choices about, and then how this feeling-based pathway needs to be retrained as well. How it is that we can actually step into the experience of anxiety, but recognize how it is we're going to move through it, and do that in a really cumulative and progressive way. So you're not finding yourself in that place where you're just like, get me the hell out of here, where we're pressing the abort button. How's everything going? Kelly, Karen, yay. Oh, watching Overlooking the Obstacle Course Arena. That does sound perfect. I love it. Hi, Nan. Hi, Gail. Hi, Carly. Lovely to see you. So it's a really fascinating topic. And I think if you can start to approach anxiety with curiosity and take on board what I'm saying, you can see how there is rhyme and reason to why it's happening. And further on from that, how it is that you are going to manage it in a way that empowers you and allows you to find a way forward that is progressive and effective and long lasting, because that's really what we're wanting. Good morning, Dee. So I'd love to hear any thoughts that you have, any questions that you have. I'm more than happy to answer them. And if you identify with either of these, then let me know, because we can totally find a way forward from that. The Calm Pathway that I have in Joyride, my membership program, deals with this in explicit detail. It's one of my things. And really my heart breaks. And I don't mean that in a really flippant way, but the conversations that I have with so many riders who are debilitated with anxiety to the point where either they're feeling like they're going to throw the towel in or give up, or it's just robbing them of any joy that's possible in their riding, it's sad. It's really sad. And I get it, because it can feel so stink. It can be the worst place to be if you feel like you're constantly under the cloud of anxiety or under the cloud of fear. And it doesn't have to be that way. But what you do need is a really progressive strategy. You need a step-by-step process that can take you there. And that's not something that can be given to you in a comment or just over one session. That's something that we need to work through over a period of time, just so that you have the support there at the same time as you have the skills and the strategy, because both are really important to a successful result. Okay, love to hear your thoughts. I hope you have a fabulous day. We're going to talk more tomorrow. Need to check out what the topic is that I've outlined tomorrow, but we can continue on with this discussion and absolutely take it from there. Lauren, yeah, so Lauren's saying that she keeps thinking that she should sell her horses. If it's something related to what it is that I'm talking about, then I think give yourself a chance to actually work with it in a proactive way, because we can what's interesting and what's frustrating, and we all do this, is that we get in the midst of some sort of emotional challenge and we feel like it's the end of the road. We feel like we've tried everything, but actually we haven't tried everything. There are really good books out there. There are really good trainers and coaches and teachers, and there are really ineffective ones as well. So if something isn't working for you, just keep looking and keep seeking. And if that desire is there to actually, keep writing and keep doing what you love, then I'm so passionate about this, because like I say, I have heartbreaking conversations all the time where I'm like, no, come on. We know that there's a better way forward. So Lauren, I'm more than happy to chatter about it with you. It's totally, I'd be happy to. All right, guys, have a fabulous day, and share any thoughts with me and I will get back to you on those, or we can bring them up in the discussion tomorrow. Hi, Sally. Awesome. Bye, guys.